Trump or whether he's good or bad, I don't care. But the point was, the reason that Donald Trump was able to win was there's a strong subset of individuals who believed that voting for Donald Trump would accelerate the hyperreal, and this was all a simulation and it was fake. That nothing bad would happen. I would just simply vote for Donald Trump and that would be it, right? Well, the professor says that can be very dangerous because it ultimately leads to really, really potentially bad things happening, like individuals trying to pull out of the Paris Accord, right? So if I see a deer walking across the street, I'm just going to say it's real. I don't think it's a simulation. I do not think there's a computer in my head simulating this, right? And that's the danger of the following Baudrillard theories limited to books. I got to move on because I want to make sure I cover sort of everything, and I don't want to encroach too much on Strauss's time. But if you have questions after this, write it down about Baudrillard. Come up and chat with me during the break. We'll talk about it more. Is that fair? Fair? All right, sweet. All right. Maybe not as interesting, but definitely something that's helpful. Oh, well, there's more to this card. There you go. Somebody read that card real quick. Go.
The commodification of education is grounded in the relationship between production and consumption. Schools produce good students, class results, and also enroll good students. They try to pursue them for their own survival and access. Results do matter. The schools generate a promotion based on the results of tangible items. Even more, by promoting a different orientation, schools could gain a competitive advantage. Segmentation, positioning, and differentiation are strong marketing attributes. Marketing education seems to be based on sameness, and since commodified education focuses on measures and standards which are rooted in sameness. In reducing the complexity of educational endeavor, the education service loses, to some extent, its reclaimed individuality and becomes a measured mass commodity. As a whole event seems to feature what Baudrillard terms simulacra, it could be assumed that sameness and differentiation are more rhetorical than real.
All right. So that was the finish of that card, but I was seduced by the cross-ex questions you all were asking me about Baudrillard. I totally forgot. All right. Paulo Freire is a Brazilian philosopher, inspired Giraud, and maybe even worked with Giraud. He wrote a very, very important book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is very, very important. And I think this is going to help a lot of people when it comes to either writing an affirmative or for those of you all who like to, not to like, but debate teams that don't read a plan, I have a very creative strategy for you. In The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire says that in the book, sorry, he produces a strategy for liberation for the oppressed. That it will produce an awakening of critical awareness and a reorientation of education. He believes that the partnership between the student and the teacher is the basis for how we can deconstruct oppression and deconstruct the role of oppressor, oppressee. Freire, and this is very, very important, says that oppressed people must see outside of themselves, and that only oppressed people can resolve or save themselves from oppression. He says what constrains oppressed people's ability to break away from oppression is the fear of freedom. Because the oppressed have been so demonized by their oppressors that they fear a life outside of them. He says in order to break this down, we must start at the level of education. Freire believes that anything beyond this starting point will be ineffective at breaking the cycle of oppression and violence. He said that this was very, very important for those oppressed peoples to become humanized. Those of you all who are interested in anti-blackness, here's where some of the contradictions and challenges kind of come into play, right? But he believed that this was the way in which those oppressed people become humanized and gain access to those things that individuals who are deemed as human have access to. The banking system is a way of education. This is the banking system. I teach, you listen. There is no back and forth. There is no Manny in the back trying to tell me what I should be talking about. You all are to listen to what I have to say. I will impart knowledge upon you. You will store that in your memory banks, and then that's it. Right? Paulo Freire said that this traditional relationship between the student and teacher, the teacher controls or operates as the oppressor versus the student who is passive. Notice how all of you all are sitting, forced to stare at me. Everyone's like this. Right? People in the front row just like this right now. Over here, same way, just like this. Well, there's a little bit of creativity right here. My man's got his legs out right there. He's bucking the system, right? Pretty radical, right? Even the people in the back are like, I'm too cool to sit up front. They're still like this, right? They're very passive in this engagement. And no matter what I say, you must obey, right? If all of you all try to like jump up and try to run out, there will be a consequence for you trying to break away from this sort of banking system approach. The counter to this, according to Freire, was a problem posing of education. He believed that the student and the teacher should enter into a partnership, and the solution to this particular banking system problem should be determined not by the teacher, but by the student. Freire believed his new praxis was spark a revolutionary manifestation in those who are oppressed. So even though you may think that you are not an oppressed subject, those are individuals who may be next to you who are like, if I am able to seize control at the age as early as education, I can challenge other forms of domination. But one of the other things he said is that oh, sorry, yes.
It could also make the argument that because from the age of where we're successful in education, they're not educated enough to make the decision to bear ourselves from oppression.
Baudrillard, I'm sorry, no, oh God. Freire would say that the only reason you think that is because you are stuck in the banking system of the student-teacher relationship. That teaching has been taught to you. You have been told that your age and your lack of, quote-unquote, lack of experience means that you are incapable of producing or teaching this kind of a course or education. Okay? Now, why do I like this argument in debate? Let me make sure I didn't like skip a slide. Nope, I didn't. Woo! I think this is a potential F. I do think this is a potential F. It's a great critical F if you think of it from this standpoint. Freire is challenging curriculum in the way it is deployed. So if the T argument is education must be curriculum, well, it would seem to meet that. So I've sort of met the T issue, right? Freire is also fixated on the fact that the problems and the oppression of education is deemed with neoliberalism and market forces. So the ad will be able to challenge a core tenet of most philosophical assumptions, right? We talked about a lot of reasons why the market is bad. And so the idea that I sort of had, I'm going to skip here for a second. I don't know, maybe you could do an ad for the United States federal government funded Freire schooling throughout the country. And this is a real thing. This is the Pablo Freire School in Wilmington, Delaware. I was shocked to find this actually. This entire school is based on his teaching. Now, I don't know if it means other words in the topic, not 100% sure. It could be an alternative for a neolib critique. Or, this is a great TVA versus abs that don't read a plan. One second. The TVA would be, the plan could simply increase funding for Freire education charter schools throughout the United States federal government. So all the abs, you get to talk about oppressed peoples in whatever manner you see, but you have to advocate for this particular strategy. Does it solve potentially all the abs? Maybe not, but it perfects your name grounds. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry. In a green shirt and did it in headphones.
I'm trying to understand where the man was coming from again. Let's see, he was born in Brazil, right, in the 1920s?
So what?
He was born in Brazil in the 1920s,
Right.
They would have only had 30 years without slavery in the last country he gave up slavery.
He is speaking more so of like Brazil in the 60s, and I think early 70s. But yeah, he was born in the 20s.
Yeah, so Brazil would have still had a caste system. I just don't see how it's going to apply to American caste system is not play in.
Oh, you don't think the caste system in America exists? Hold that question for Chris Randall and the Andy Blackman's question. Trust me. Yes, in the back with the headphones.
So you said that like they didn't you like said that the banking system caused students to be something like oppressive subject. But like getting rid of the banking system and making students not be oppressed subject, what does that solve for?
Well, it's all for sort of the way, well, that goes back to what I sort of said earlier, is that Freire believed that if we can sort of radically shift the way in which students are imposed knowledge, right? Let's take, what's your name, please? What's that right here? Yes. Tiana? Okay. Remember she said that what if someone said, I am not old enough to be able to teach or produce these things, right? If we can sort of break that sort of thought process of I am a lower class individual and I must be subjected to this way of teaching, because that could also spark maybe a thought or a revolutionary practice about to challenge other forms of oppression. There's a bit of a spillover effect. Does that make sense? And so that's kind of the angle that argument takes. All right. Woo. Yes?
What does Freire say the role of the state?
The role of what?
Like, the role of the state.
The state?
Yeah.
I don't know if he takes a particular position on the state per se. I think if the state engages in a form of oppression, then he will say that the only way to sort of overthrow that or deal with that is to sort of reject sort of the premise in which oppression is taught, which is at the education system. The state probably needs to change. The state probably needs to be amended, but it can only be amended by those who are oppressed. Now, does that lend itself to like a violent overthrow of the government or a radical deconstruction of an ethic of the government? Possible. All right. All right, let's move on to these. Yes?
So you're saying that Freire is like saying that we should reject kind of thing. How would like Freire's education work like this?
Say that part loud.
How would like Freire's education work like the classroom?
I think actually if you go to that, and I'll have a link on the PowerPoint slide, if you go to that school, you'll sort of see how they've sort of changed the way the schooling works, right? It's not premised on sort of grades, per se. It's more so premised on the way in which you sort of identify a demonstration that you can actually understand and communicate and do whatever the educational task that is done. It also indicates that the model is a little bit different, so students sit differently. They tend to be the ones leading the discussion, which sort of helps them understand the world a lot better. So there's a lot of radical ways in which you can shift that in order for it to occur. All right? Okay. So we're going to talk about identity critiques here. We've got a little bit of time. I have race and anti-blackness up here. Remember that will be covered by Chris Randall in a larger lecture. So I won't go into great detail on that one, but I will talk about the other four in a bit of detail, okay? Now first I want to start with sort of queer and trans critiques. All right? Now there is in the packet a trans pessimism argument. I do want to talk about that briefly to sort of give people an introduction to sort of what that argument is. The trans pessimism argument. The trans pessimism argument argues that anti-discrimination laws or the upholdment of those particular laws are fundamentally incompatible of addressing the fundamental issues associated with the violence that trans and queer people deal with. You hear a lot of authors that say queer theory say that queerness is the opposite of the norm, or things that are normal. Okay? In the B card of that particular shell, or the B card of that particular argument, there are a few warrants that I do want to point out. And this is, I believe, the card here, right here. I won't read it. We don't have time. First argument is that the law operates through a perpetrator-victim system. Right? So someone is a criminal, someone is a victim. But under that system, it individualizes racism. It means that, oh, that's just one or two people doing something that's bad and not emblematic of a larger culture or substructure. All right? He says, oh, these are just bad people making really bad choices, but that's not everyone. Under that system, it is impossible to destroy the particular culture that produces that kind of violence in the first place, according to the trans pest critique. The second warrant is that resistance strategies for trans and queer bodies are always funneled through the lens of the law which is incapable of doing anything to address the largest culture of violence that they are focused on. So if the law is ineffective and resistance strategies focus individuals to the law, then they will never be able to address the violence that trans and queer bodies face. Does that make sense? Make sense? Okay. The alt calls for a shifting away from rights/law-based talk, rights/law-based framework, and that we need to create a new ideal to dismantle the system, right? This gets to some of your questions where you're like, what is the role of the state? Their argument is that the state needs to be dismantled in its current effort. It needs to be dismantled in its current form, okay? And then we need to theorize new ways of challenging that particular system. If you are interested in queer theory, there are 2 books you need to read or have. I will write these down. The first is Lee Edelman's No Future, Queer Theory and the Death Drive. And Jack/Judith Haberstrom's The Queer Art of Failure. In Edelman's book, he makes the claim that progress for the queer body, remember queer is the opposite of normal, is a lie, it is a fantasy, through which neoliberalism attempts to orient those bodies to the norm and to the preservation and benefit of the marketplace. Here again, we see the reduction of neoliberalism as sort of the source that produces violence once again. And so, if the 1AC tries to fit people into like the certain student through the educational system, chances are someone will make the argument that you are trying to normalize the queer body and that is inherently violent. Jack/Judith Haberstrom, goes by both, argues that queer bodies should advocate for failure in all instances. No matter what the situation, always advocate for failure. Because the possibility of hope is uniquely violent. The belief that they can become normal is a violent process. Haberstrom says that we should reject hope. That is the only way to escape the punishment of the status quo. Hold on one second, I want to finish this, okay? So if you have a question, come down and see me. This is what Haberstrom calls the low theory. I think those are 2 very, very important books that you need to read. Even if you're not interested in queer theory, you will hear a queer critique, queerness critique, or a queer trans argument. You should read these books. Settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is the existence of the United States because it was premised on the genocide of Native Americans. Scholars suggest that indigenous indifference is fundamental to the continuation of Native extermination, i.e. the violence that Natives went through is something that individuals do not feel is a thing. The U.S. is still good. Settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. It is not a one-time act of the genocide of Native Americans, but is a continuation of that Native indifference through a variety of things, such as failed treaties between tribal organizations and the United States federal government. The U.S. upholds this exploitation of Native land through that sub-treaty structure with a promise of benefiting Native bodies, when in actuality those bodies have not received proper payment for what has been done to them. How does this relate to the topic? There are 2 things that are very, very important. How many people know what ESSA is? All right, you all should have heard this during the lecture. As part of ESSA, there's a Title VI that amends the Indian education program. This is the law itself. Can I get somebody to read that real quick? Yes?
From section 7.1, 6.1 statements, policy is policy of the United States to the federal government and international relationship with
A little louder, a little louder.
responsibility to the Indian people for the education of Indian children. The federal government will continue to work with local educational agencies and new tribal organizations, post-secondary institutions, and other entities towards the goal of ensuring that programs that serve elite children are of the highest quality to provide for not only the basic elementary and secondary educational needs, but also the unique education and politically and academically fulfilled. It is further the policy of the United States to ensure that Indian students do not attend school in buildings that are dilapidated or deteriorating, which may negatively affect the academic success of such students.
All right. So the United States has a treaty obligation that it should be funding and promoting and making sure that Native Americans have proper education in this country, which is the TLDR version of this. But there's a problem. In order to receive funding, Native American students have to fill out what is called a 506 form. A 506 form is required for Native students. They have to be tribally enrolled. They have to be a part of a tribe. Does anybody know how Native Americans determine how or whether or not someone is a part of their tribe? Okay. Hold on. Can we stop the rolling of the water? All right. Say it loud.
It's like an assessment of how much blood is made.
Right. Blood quantum. All right. So, Malachi, read this for me.
That was very strategic. So Salt Lake Tribune noted that was very strategic of the U.S. government to put in that requirement. Said Aline Quinn, Title VI coordinator for the Negro School District in Utah County. Do you realize we are the only racial group that has to prove who they are? I mean, what the hell? We don't ask black people or Mexicans. We don't ask white people who are Dutch or Russians who they are. The U.S. government, they knew we would intermarry, and they knew within a few generations they would no longer be responsible. Every American tribe, including the 5 based in Utah, has a blood quantum requirement. How much of a person's lineage must be traced to the tribe to enroll? Some allow people to enroll with as little as 1/32 tribal blood. The Ute tribe has the highest blood quantum in the nation, 5/8. Since American Indians are more likely to marry outside the race than any other racial group, according to the Pew Research Center, as time goes on, there are fewer full-blooded natives.
So one of the link strategies for a settler colonialism critique is the lie that one of these details of aiding Native Americans. That if you try to increase funding for fixing Native American schools, or even fixing schools in general, that would also assist Native Americans, that funding is predetermined by the number of Native Americans belonging to that tribe. But if they do not pass a blood quantum requirement, they are not considered Native Americans of that tribe. So the 1AC participates in the lie of tribal treaties and organizations. You embrace the tribal indifference, which is one strategy that they will say. And then they will go on to talk about why that is uniquely bad. Ableism. I think that this Craig I'm saying it wrong. I'll say correct. I think sort of summarizes the way in which ableism operates. Ableism is the argument that indicates that the treatment of quote-unquote able bodies and disabled bodies is bad. Can I get someone over here? Right here, Georgia.
Craig Fairness is a contributing writer for Everyday Feminism. She's a graduate student pursuing a master's degree in speech and language pathology, and already has a BA in psychology and post-bachelor in communication sciences and disorders. Craig is still learning more every day, and her sister Taylor reads, edits, and produces everything that Craig writes about disabilities.
All right. Keep going.
I wake up with nightmares about elementary school. I'm 22 years old. I'm a college graduate. I don't live in the same city as any of the schools I attended, so I'm never forced to go past my own schools or bump into my old teachers. However, the trauma I experienced from grade school was so intense that I still wake up screaming sometimes. So why this pain still? If you have nightmares too, you experience the ableist violence, discrimination, targeting, and exclusion of the school system the way I and many disabled people have. I really wish I could say that this is all any disabled student face, but it's by no means anywhere close, especially for kids with intersecting marginalized identities and circumstances. First, the school staff ignored, encouraged, and participated in bullying. Second, the school staff fought against giving me accommodations. Third, the They acted like I was incompetent because I'm disabled. Before, they saw nothing but my weakness.
All right, thank you. So the reason I wanted to talk about this, oh wait, sorry, here's one.
In fact, my worst bullies, the ones I was most terrified of, often were my teachers. They yelled at me when I was frightened and hid under the desk because the sounds of the room were being prepared. They smiled to my face, but seized with anger that I couldn't detect until they exploded underneath. When I was in high school, the guidance counselor refused to allow me to take advanced replacement classes. She didn't attempt to hide the reason why. She simply said, DSE, disabled students, don't take advanced placement classes. When I was in 5th grade, my mother was summoned to a school meeting. Some students' influential parents have complained, they said, about having disabled students in class with typical students, and it was annoying for the teachers for having to deal with my behavior, calling out a turn, constantly typical for ADHD and autism in class. They then tried to kick me out of the school.
Thank you. So the reason I wanted to point this out was because this is sort of the way in which ableism discourse sort of will be prevalent in this year's topic. The issue isn't necessarily provisions that are afforded to disabled individuals, but it's the lack of the teachers and administration to follow through with that. Okay? So even if your plan sort of addresses sort of the structure law components of it, there's a culture of ableism that the 1AC does not advocate for and that it papers over, which would be the substructure of the link argument. Let's go through a couple of things. Craig says that the school staff ignored, encouraged, or participated in bullying. Even though there are policies on the books and procedures for anti-bullying, teachers consistently yelled and abused students because teachers did not understand the students with disabilities. There's a particular point where she says, and I quote, "They yelled at me because I was frightened and hid under my desk when there were loud sounds of the roof being repaired. They did not understand the reason for why she did that. They assumed that she should be just like every other student." That culture of ableism is permeated throughout the school system. Okay? And I guarantee you an advocate simply say that that must be rejected. So the school staff fought against giving me accommodations, more of a circumvention argument, right? The law is supposed to give these great accommodations, but the school systems themselves refuse to give it. Things like she has to have a special computer to type out her assignments on and let her teacher print it out. But her teacher did not want her on her computer, and so she didn't begin to get marks or F's because she did not turn in assignments or homework in time. They began to treat her as if she was deviant. Why? Because she was not the norm. And if you're not the norm, then what can't you do? You can't benefit the market. See how this all kind of entails? Make sense? Right? Third, she said they acted like I was incompetent because of my disability. Remember the part where it says that she was not allowed to take AP classes because I assumed disabled people could not take AP classes because they're too hard. Further producing the us-them dichotomy, the norm-disabled dichotomy. And then finally, they saw nothing but weakness. Right? This happens to a lot of disabled students, where they see the actual condition and not the fact that they are actually students capable of doing great things. If you are debating or engaging in this sort of literature base, your 1AC needs to account for that sort of culture of ableism. If it does not, you will hear a lot of ableist critiques. Just because you wrote an AB that deals with special education doesn't mean that it challenges the fundamental structure of the culture of ableism in schools. All right? I could talk about a ton of other things, but that is essentially my lecture. If you have questions, I'd be free to answer them, but I greatly appreciate your time. Thank you very much.